Hello, this is Gonzalo Lira speaking to you live from Kharkov, Ukraine, and this is the Roundtable number 38, Why Bakhmut Matters. I'm joined by Brian Berletic of the New Atlas channel, Dima of the Military Summary channel, and Alex of History Legends. And so it's going to be just an all-military, like big brain kind of broadcast, because they have the brains, but I have the looks. So some of us are lucky, and
we can't take that out of you.
Oh, by the way, the last 35 minutes of the broadcast, I'm going to bring on some Patreon supporters. If you're a Patreon supporter, pay attention to the Patreon page where I will post the link so you guys can join the last 35 minutes. You can ask questions of my guests, but be brief and to the point. And so, yeah, looking forward to it. And so let's get cracking. Who wants to start? Well, military summary, Dima, and I'll just refer to you guys by your first names. Dima is like the big brain of the military. He's following this thing like every second, like the biggest chess game in history. So, Dima, can you break down why Bakhmut matters? Just give us why this particular battle is becoming so crucial in this entire conflict.
Yes, of course. For these purposes, if you don't mind, I would like to share the screen.
Sure.
Okay, this is Ukraine. I believe you're familiar with this country, with these regions. This is the territory. The red one is that under Russian control, and the territory without color, without any, is the territory I believe that Ukrainian controls. And this is Bakhmut, the battle, the biggest battle for ages or maybe for years. And the Russians stormed this town at least from three sides: from the west, from the south, and so on. And Bakhmut is very important for many reasons. The first thing that, just from the regular understanding, the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian president and Ukrainian authorities promised that Severodonetsk agglomeration is the last agglomeration that the Russians were able to take, and after that they won't be able to take anything. So this is like some kind of promise from the president of Ukraine, and this is like the first reason why Bakhmut is so important, just to show that there is nothing that can't be changed in days, in years, or something like this. From the other perspective, Bakhmut is some kind of gates that opens the door, that opens the some kind of territory that the Russians are able to use to start offensive operation in direction of Kramatorsk, in direction of Slaviansk, if you see on the map. And the most important, the most interesting thing that today the Russian military expert discusses that as soon as the Russians are able to take Bakhmut, after that they will start their development in direction of Pokrovsk. So as you can see, there is a road that connects Bakhmut with Pokrovsk. It's like N32 road. You see, it's like a very big rocade. This road moves from Chasov Yar, Konstantinovka, and then we can find ourselves in Pokrovsk. And this is very interesting development because these days from the south, the Russians tries to develop their offensive operation in Pesky in direction of the same Pokrovsk. And furthermore, from Marinka in direction of Kurakhova, and then at the same direction Pokrovsk. So as you can see,
Pokrovsk is the main logistical hub of the Ukrainian army.
Yes,
this is where all the supplies are redistributed. So if they lose this, they have to move back 100 kilometers or something. This is where they send all the reinforcements. This is the logistical hub, like the Amazon Center warehouse.
Furthermore, I would like to add that, if of course it's not the operation of one day, it's operation of months. But anyway, while developing, while making some progress, the Russians will be able to solve two more issues, like New York agglomeration fortification and Avdiivka fortification. So they will be able to encircle this fortification from the north, and they will be able finally to solve the issues with endless and unstoppable shelling and reducing Donetsk till ruin. So this is the reason why Bakhmut is so important. And of course, the Russians will be able to develop to the north to Slaviansk and Kramatorsk. So they will have some kind of operational square.
And also Bakhmut, if you look at the map, north of it is Siversk. So if you take Bakhmut, Siversk falls, but it will be
automatically.
Yeah, it will fall automatically. So you see that the entire Ukrainian offensive towards Kremina, so if you can go up a bit to the north, so the entire Ukrainian attacks in this area, if Bakhmut falls, the Ukrainians will have to pull back because they will be flanked by the Russian army. So Bakhmut is also very important in terms of Ukrainian capabilities to attack on this front.
The only thing I can add about Bakhmut, that according to the latest official position of Ukrainian authorities, these days they are saying that Bakhmut is not important. That Bakhmut is, from tactical perspective, is difficult to defend, is difficult to hold, and this town plays no game in this entire situation. But if you take a look, and I believe if you follow my channel, you saw the updates from deployment map. I believe that according to the deployment map, there are around 30, maybe 40,000 soldiers who these days tries to stop the Russians near Bakhmut. But to tell the truth, my opinion, because many weeks ago we had almost the same roundtable, and we discussed about Kharkiv, and we on that roundtable we said that we completely believe that the Russians would be able to take Kharkiv by the end of this year, but something went wrong, and today everything can change from second to second. So I believe that maybe Bakhmut is not like the focal point of this operation, and I believe the Ukrainians that maybe this town is not so important. The most important part in Bakhmut battle is Ukrainian army. As I told you, one of the most experienced the forces who were trained in the United Kingdom, who were trained in Romania and France and Germany, they are there. They're around Bakhmut, and of course, if the Russians are able to destroy this army, to reduce this army without even taking Bakhmut, believe me, they will be able to achieve significant success, and they will be able, let's say, to open another gates to attack, let's say, near Chernigov, near Sumy on the border with Belarus, or on Zaporozhye area, anywhere. Anywhere else.
And I posted my video about casualties yesterday, and it's interesting. The final result I came up with, so I kind of try to calculate how many losses Ukrainian has suffered, and I come to about 80,000 KIA, and it's about the number you have on your sheet, Dima. Like I mentioned your sheet, and it's about the same, like 85,000, and it's very interesting.
I would like to add that I started calculating the losses just from July. So these numbers, they don't include the numbers from February till not even July, till June. I started this table on June. I have some kind of like a gap. So I believe that the losses are higher, and we can add another 40,000 of Ukrainian losses from, let's say, 25th or 22nd of February till June. So there is big period is not included.
Okay. Because, good to know. I'll add this in the comment section. But the methodology was, what's good with the Battle of Bakhmut is that we have Western journalists tell us the amount of casualties they see. And it's not Ukrainian sources, it's not Russian, it's Western journalists that say, oh, today we saw 300 wounded come in that one place. Another says 250. And if we average, we're about at 700 killed or wounded every day in Bakhmut, and that's a battalion gone every day. So if we use the amount of shells that the Russians bombard Bakhmut with, we can have an approximation of the losses and are correlated to artillery. So the amount of Russian artillery shells, how many casualties it makes. And this is the scenario I chose, Bakhmut, but this is Ukraine in defense. What about when Ukraine was on the offensive in open terrain? Losses must have been at least double that number.
Yeah,
that's why
they were much larger. The West is talking about all of these gains that Ukraine made around Kharkov and Kherson, but in reality, they were losing brigades worth of men and equipment. Another thing about Bakhmut right now, the Western media is, when they're doing their propaganda and not talking numbers, they're saying, as many Russians are dying as Ukrainians, which, I mean, at face value, that doesn't really sound very good for Ukraine. It doesn't sound like they're winning. At best, a stalemate. But in reality, they're also admitting that they're outgunned, something like 6-1. I've seen in Western sources admit 6-1. They're outgunned by Russia 6-1. So how is it possible that Russia is losing this many men to Ukraine when they have Ukraine outgunned 6-1? Doesn't make any sense. They also say that the vast majority of the casualties are Wagner mercenaries. A lot of them are convicted criminals. So again, as Dima is saying, these are the best troops Ukraine has dying in Bakhmut, and convicted criminals fighting for Wagner. If you believe the Western media, again, it doesn't sound like Ukraine is winning at all. It sounds pretty bleak for Ukraine at Bakhmut.
And the thing is that, like you said, they always say, "Oh yeah, like the consolation prize." Yeah, but the Russians have about the same. And the problem is, according to my estimates, Russian losses, so everyone included, LDPR, Chechens, Wagner, Russian armed forces, it's about 15,000 KIA, roughly, right? It's much less than the maybe 80, 100,000 KIA of the Ukrainian army. And this is
this is what, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that according to Ursula von der Leyen, it was 100,000 KIA on the Ukraine side, and that was quickly deleted because it was a huge blow to morale over here. But a lot of other very credible estimates, including, I believe, Doug McGregor, they're putting the number of KIA on the Zelensky regime side at closer to 120 and perhaps higher. And there's something else too, that the wounded, the proportion of wounded, traditionally it's like 4-to-1, 3-to-1 insofar as wounded, but insofar as the Zelensky regime, because of the lack of medical facilities, it's closer to 1-to-1. That a lot of the people who are severely injured, they're just not getting the medical attention, and so they're losing their lives because there's just not enough to go around.
According to what I see, it's about, traditionally we say 3 wounded for 1 KIA, but that's World War II. And since then, whatever we say, medicine is better, equipment is better. So even the Ukrainian army, they have proper medics, they have body armor, they have. But what I mean is that it's about 6 wounded for 1 KIA. And the thing with the wounded is that, what is a wounded? If you run and you break your ankle, you're wounded, but then you can return to fight eventually. But someone that has his leg that blown up is also wounded. So the thing is, most Ukrainian soldiers that are wounded are just temporarily out of the front, but they will be returned to combat as soon as possible. So that's the thing that I see from the Ukrainian side, is that you're in the army forever. There's no tour of duty. This is their war. So if you're wounded, okay, you're taken to the rear and then patched up and you're sent back in reserve.
Well, ultimately, it doesn't matter insofar as the wounded, insofar as this conversation is concerned, because ultimately what matters is actual KIAs.
Exactly.
It seems ugly to say it in such grotesque terms, but I'm saying it as a practical issue insofar as this war is concerned. And so if the Russians, I think that we can all agree that it's at least 100,000 KIA on the side of Ukraine, and not more than 15,000, okay, let's say 20,000 on all Russian different groups, right? That's still 5-to-1. And on top of that, the Russians have amassed an army that at this point must number at least 600,000 men, because 2 weeks ago it was 540,000, and they were shipping in tanks and men and gear, nonstop. You see all those videos of trains. And so, the question becomes, at what moment, at what tipping point moment does the Zelensky regime army simply collapse because it just doesn't have any more gas in the tank? You see what I'm saying?
Well, I don't know. We've been having this conversation for many months, and
yeah. Because I think that, the Zelensky regime has put all of its chips on Bakhmut. Now, Brian, I'll ask you. You're a politically minded guy. The loss of Bakhmut, quite apart from the military situation, which would be like Popasnaya 2.0, where all of a sudden, once they take Bakhmut, they're able to strike in different directions, as Dima outlined. If Bakhmut were to fall after these catastrophic losses that have happened, what do you think would be the political effects?
Well, also, as Dima pointed out, Zelensky said it will not fall. So if it falls, then what does that make out of anything else Zelensky says, which he's already on shaky grounds? And the thing is, we were told that Ukraine turned the tide. They're on the offensive. Russia is in shambles. They're retreating. This is the beginning of the end for Russia. we can see with our eyes that this offensive of Ukraine has ground to a halt. It's positional fighting across the line of contact, and now you have this situation in Bakhmut where the Western media is trying to prepare the public for its eventual fall. Trying to dismiss its importance, saying, well, they're already building defenses in the rear. Well, why would they be doing that if everything was going so
We've
well?
heard that before. We've heard that before. We've
Yeah.
heard these tales before, right? With Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, all of a sudden, oh yeah, it's not important anymore.
Mariupol also. First of all, they were still somehow fighting, even though they were hiding underground. And then when it became clear that was the end for Ukraine and Mariupol, they said it didn't matter. It serves no purpose. It's an irrelevant city.
I think
they don't even talk about it.
What's interesting is that I think both sides kind of do this. Whenever there's a retreat, I think it's important to say that it's not important. But in this case, Ukraine, it's Ukrainian territory. So when Russia pulls back from an area in Ukraine, it's not their land. Let's say they don't really care. But for Ukraine, it hits 10 times harder. And Bakhmut, I think there's one thing that people also don't see, because on this map we can't really see the elevation of the terrain. But if you see left of Bakhmut, there's a city called Chasiv Yar. And this one is located on some heights. It's some sort of line goes from north to south. And it's hills, a lot of elevated terrain. And this is the last line of elevated terrain in Donbass. So after that, it's all flat land, which is very hard to defend, because with drones and artillery, you can see everything. So I think the position that is the most important now for Ukraine is Chasiv Yar. And I think this is the region where the Russians might try to push.
Hey,
if you look at Bakhmut...
Dima, can you point out where this... What's the name of... Alex, what's the name of this town
Chasiv
again?
Yar. It's just left of Bakhmut. Can you show it? Yeah, here.
Can you circle it or something so we can scope it out? Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay. And just zoom out. Yeah. This area here, if you look at the Russian maneuver, it's to encircle Bakhmut from both the north and the south. Of course, if they can enter the city directly, it's easier. But I think if they take this high ground there, it's over for Ukraine in Donbass, because it's going to be very hard to find a better position. You see? And the Russians are...
I heard a lot of updates about, and the military experts who are saying that as soon as the Russians are able to take Bakhmut, then they will try to take Chasiv Yar. But I must say that Chasiv Yar is much more difficult to take than Bakhmut for many reasons. The first one is that, as you told, Chasiv Yar is on the highlands, right, and Bakhmut is on the lowland. This is like the first thing. Another thing that the most important is that Chasiv Yar has some kind of industrial barrier on the north. I'm talking about railroad rockade. As you can see, this is the railroad rockade that protects Chasiv Yar from the north. And I believe that it's highly unlikely, or it will take a lot. It will cost a lot for the Russians to attack Chasiv Yar from the north, because we know that we can say that the previous 2 months was the battle for rockades. There was the battle for Road of Life, T-13 rockade, where the Russians were trying to attack and to take control over Yakovlevka, and they started this operation somewhere in May, and just in December, after 7 months, they managed to cross this rockade. The Ukrainians haven't crossed this railroad rockade near Nivolska. They still try to cross, but it's very difficult. So any rockade is a very difficult barrier for any party. And to take Chasiv Yar, I see as a possible solution is just from the south.
Yeah, exactly.
But if the Russians attack Chasiv Yar from the south, it might cost them a lot, because these mines this field completely mined, and all the time the Russians attack from Konstantinov, Kotaretsk. So Chasiv Yar is another long story for the Russians, and to tell the truth, for now, I don't have any solution, any understanding how the Russians are planning to take Chasiv Yar.
You see, if we look at can you remove the arrows? And
yes, I can remove the arrows, and for this purpose, I need to update the map.
yeah, just because for the audience, right? So circle Chasiv Yar. Yeah, okay. But there's one thing that we have to look at. It's the battle for Klishivka and Ivanivka, right? And I think
by the way, just I will update the map according to the latest Russian update. According to information we have from the Russian sources, they got control over the north part of Klishevka, and through Andreevka, they got control over the south part of Klishevka.
Exact.
So they answer from at least from two sides.
Perfect, thank you. And the thing, what I see, the plan is that first they hop from one village. So the Russian strategy is to hop from one village to another and use the village they just took as a pivot point towards another, right? It's a very simple tactic, but very methodical. Now, the village they're trying to attack now, Klishivka, would be a perfect stepping stone to go further north and cut off Bakhmut from the west. You know, if you put Ivanivka, right, there's a village in between Chasiv Yar. Yeah, exactly. It's the last village before this encirclement. And the Russians are doing this in a very methodical process. So I think these places are very important to look at for the progress of the Battle of Bakhmut, because if the Russians reach this highway, it's going to be very tough. It's going to be very tough for Ukraine to be supplied. What do you think?
The thing is that if we are talking about this area, first of all, if the Russians want to develop their offensive operation from Klishevka to Ivanovska, to this town, they will have to cross the fields. Yeah. And I checked the weather, and the weather the next 2 months, 2 weeks will be in this area around +1 degree according to Celsius. So that means that it will be very difficult to use this ground, because the Russian tanks and all their armored vehicles will stuck in this area. So it's I saw this like projection from some Russian military experts, and I completely not agree with the direction to attack Ivanovska, because I believe that the Russians won't be able just even to get there. They will die somewhere in the middle of this time. The only thing that the Russians are able to do in this area is to establish fire control and to cut this road physically with artillery, with their anti-tanks. So they will be able to cut, and the Ukrainians won't be able to use this N32 road to supply and support Bakhmut from Chasiv Yar. In this case, the Ukrainians still will have the road that moves a little bit to the north, this one, to supply Bakhmut. So to take Ivanovska is not the solution to, I don't know, to get control over Bakhmut. It's not solution. It will give the Russians a lot of losses and problems. And furthermore, imagine yourself how the Russians are able to hold control over Ivanovska during the bad weather and the bad ground. They need to supply and support this town they need to hold this area at least a month. As soon as the Russians are able to take Ivanovska, it doesn't mean that Bakhmut is going to follow automatically. It's not. They need to hold Ivanovska for months, and all these months, the only one possible way to support this town is from Klishevka. And it's impossible. It's not even highly unlikely. It's impossible to hold Ivanovska for a very long time, because all the time the Russian forces in Ivanovska will be under crossfire from two towns.
And what do you think about the axis of the north, Pidohorodny? What do you think about this events in this northern part? Because they blew up all the bridges in the northern sector.
The Russians will they're now concentrated over this town, and sooner or later they will take control over this area. And after Podgorodny, they will try to develop their offensive operation in direction of Krasnogora. These two towns. Why is that? Because all these two towns is located on the Russian side of Rokade. This is the railroad Rokade. The Russians don't need to cross them. They can take this town by local attacks with tanks. And if we're talking about the Ukrainians, for them it will be very difficult even to deploy tanks in this area, because there are no. The only place to get there is through this road, but there is like a very large hook to get some forces in this area, and there's just one bridge that the Ukrainians are able to use to do this, and it's very close from the Russian position. So Krasnogora, Podgorodny will be taken by the Russians. But anyway, even in this case, the Russians need to cross this railroad Rokade, and it's like 2 lines of Rokade. It's very difficult to encircle Bakhmut from the north. As I understand, the only thing that the Russians are able to do to establish fire control over supply and support roads of Bakhmut from the west, from the north, from the northwest, and so on. And they can storm this Bakhmut like in front, losing their soldiers, and the Ukrainians will lose. And to use like the tactic of artillery attacks and reducing town to ruins, and to force the Ukrainians just to step back because of heavy losses. Furthermore, don't forget that in December, we haven't received, at least maybe I missed this update. In December, we haven't received any updates from the Western countries about upcoming support of Ukraine. The last one, when we heard about sending to Ukraine around 200 of armored vehicles, was in November. So no plans in December. I don't see any upcoming plans in January. And something tells me that the battle for Bakhmut is it's like another way to develop this idea, is that Bakhmut is a part of Kherson deal. If you remember, many times I told in my videos that Kherson was a part of deal. The Russians returned step back from this bridgehead without even any clashes. And 3 or 4 weeks ago, when the Russians stepped back from Kherson, I told that maybe by the end of this year, we're going to see how the Ukrainians are retreating from Bakhmut. And official topics, official position from the Ukrainian side that we see these days, that Bakhmut is not important, also may be a part of this deal. That the Western countries forced the Ukrainians to follow the deal, because this deal was signed not between Ukraine and Russians. It was between Blinken and Russian Federation. So between these two guys, it's like their deal, not the Ukrainians. And now the Western countries forced the Ukrainians to follow the deal and to step back from Bakhmut. And I hope that maybe this is some kind of art, some kind of movie we see these days in Bakhmut, nothing more. So the Ukrainians, they also need to show they can't step back from Bakhmut because of some kind of deal between some American man and the Russians. They can't do this. They need to show drama. They need to show losses. They need to show casualties. They need to show
The thing is, some imaginary deal that might be happening, we don't know about these things. So let's
don't
stick
know
to what we know.
I would say,
Brian?
I would say that as Russia's senior commanders have been saying, this is a war of attrition. This situation in Bakhmut is a battle of attrition. I fully agree with the difficulties of fully encircling Bakhmut, storming it. This is always difficult, no matter what city you're talking about. If the Western media is admitting that Russia has Ukraine outgunned 6-1, well, all Russia wants, and they're in no rush to take this city. What is the reason for them to rush? I don't see any reason. Every day that goes by, and Dima, you pointed out how slim the aid has become from the West to Ukraine. That is a reality. It has been getting slimmer and slimmer each month. Every month it gets worse and worse, because they simply don't have anything left to send Ukraine. They don't have armored vehicles. They were sending Hummers, and then they were sending
believe me, they have
pickup
Abrams.
trucks.
They have Abrams. They have F-16.
Yeah, but they're
they
not
have
sending them. They're not going.
Yeah,
to
that's
send them
not-
because it's
yeah.
politically,
Look,
it's not. It's
why
no
why
go.
isn't Britain sending, Britain is very involved in this war. Why aren't they sending 200 Challenger tanks to Ukraine? That could
It's impossible. The amount of training, unless you're going to have British soldiers operating them and creating the logistics to support them. Western main battle tanks, they're bigger, they're heavier. The M1 Abrams has a turbine engine. It's consumes huge amounts of fuel. This is not practical for Ukraine. It would take 6 months to train an entry-level tanker, but a tank crew is not just entry-level tankers. You have a tank commander that has years of experience. Where are they going to get and train up the manpower for a sizable tank force? And then how are they going to support it logistically in the
Brian,
field?
you want to say that HIMARS that were supplied to Ukraine are operated by the Ukrainians?
No,
Maybe.
they're operated by NATO
they may
troops
be,
or
they
NATO
may-
contractors.
they
No,
may be, or they
maybe,
by
but
by NATO. It's 50-50. I really
so
don't
the
know.
same situation about the tanks. They will be completely operated by the way, if you remember, maybe yesterday I got a report that somewhere on the 27th of March, the Polish army are planning to enter the western part of Ukraine. Maybe on the 27th of March, we're going to see more.
But you see, this is
Well,
interesting what you say, because now we can talk also about what's happening in Belarus, because it's very
Can you
interesting.
zoom out, Dima, please? Thank you. I'm sorry, Alex.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Because some people, there's many claims right now of military buildup in Belarus. Okay, some people say it's to attack in the west of Ukraine to cut off supplies between NATO and Ukraine. Some say it's for another attack in Kiev. And overall, they always mention the entry of Belarus into the war. Now, thing is, I'm not 100% convinced that this is going to happen like that. Like, I know now Putin is in Belarus. They're meeting. There's a lot of meetings right now. So maybe Brian can enlighten us about politically what it means. But from what I read, they want to do some sort of union. So perhaps Belarus's entry into the war is first going to be Belarus joining Russia to cover themselves. I don't know, but because if Belarus just attacks, Poland can attack Belarus too, right? I don't know.
Just before Brian start, I would add one important thing that when Putin came, he told a lot of updates about this and that, about the prices for gas for 3 next years on the very low level, last around $70 per 1,000 cubic meters. And the most important thing that Putin told us is that the Russians also deployed air carriers who are able to carry very specific weapon. I will explain what does it mean. That means that with Putin, we see that maybe there is a very high chance that the Russians brought nuclear weapon on the territory of Belarus.
So I just want to expand on this idea of the U.S. sending tanks and F-16s. It may be a possibility in the future that they will try to sell this as they kind of do this mission creep into Ukraine. It's a possibility, and I don't think that Russia has unlimited amount of time to carry out its operations in Ukraine. But HIMARS, they could get away with it. It's a relatively small number of weapon systems, whether it was Ukrainians or NATO forces or contractors. It doesn't matter. It's a small number of vehicles. For a tank force, you need a lot of tanks. You can't just send a couple of tanks. It will make no difference. You have
hundreds,
to send large
two,
numbers of tanks.
Yeah. Yes, 200-300. As Delusional required. I need 300 tanks, 400 armored vehicles, and something around 500 artillery.
Okay, so let's hear Brian. Let's hear Brian.
Yes. So to send a force like that of M1 Abrams and all NATO equipment, and Zaluzhny never talked about air power, but he would also need air power. But I just don't see how they're going to provide that without openly entering into the conflict. HIMARS is something they could sneak through and pretend that they're training Ukrainians to operate. A giant tank force of hundreds of tanks, no, that would be, and logistically, they would be running all of this from Poland all the way into wherever the front line is. It's just under the best of conditions. Like, say the U.S. going into Iraq, they had problems. The U.S. had problems with U.S. troops operating these tanks, and the logistics, they had problems. Doing this into Ukraine against Russian forces, I just don't see it. It's not plausible. I think it's too far-fetched. I wouldn't rule anything out, because they're getting desperate. They're doing increasingly dangerous things. But I just don't see how this is a possibility. I think they're not sending. They're trying to send absolutely everything they have that they can practically send Ukraine, and they're out of that. They've sent everything that they can send. There really is nothing left. They're talking about procurement over the next several years, and even if they could do all of that today, instantly, the numbers that they're trying to procure is not enough to meet Ukraine's demands on the battlefield day to day.
And there's a further issue, if you don't mind my pointing out, is that, you see, if you were to send a couple of hundred M1 Abrams tanks with all the support crew and and the necessary people and gear necessary to run that outfit, you'd have to cross all of Ukraine, and the Russians have shown that they can hit anything that they want pretty much anywhere in Ukraine. And a target like that would be just big, fat, juicy, and easy to hit. So it would sort of like be like, are these tanks even going to get to the front to actually carry out any combat? So,
well, the thing is,
as a practical matter, I'm not even certain that even deploying them, which would be a political nightmare for the West, because a lot of people would get their hackles up in the air. I don't think it's, as a practical military matter, it's possible at this point.
it's like having a rifle trying to shoot a bee. Yes, if it hits the bee, it's going to do a lot of damage, but you can spread out your forces and make the use of the rifle very useless.
What are you talking about in terms of hitting a tank that's crossing Ukraine?
Imagine the Ukrainians are just spreading out. It's like depot, the ammo depot. The Russians have started spreading out these ammo depot to make the rockets not worth what they're hitting.
Yeah.
So because if you have one huge ammo depot, it's going to be a festival. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be fireworks. But if you have so many spread out, the attack, the cost of the missiles is not going to be worth what you destroy.
What are you talking about in reference
so
to
if you separate the tank forces and spread them out, I don't see how the Russians can send missiles on these forces.
There are limited numbers of pathways from Poland to eastern Ukraine, basically rail lines. What, you're going to drive them down country roads for 1,000 kilometers?
No, what I mean is that we've seen how destroying railroads doesn't really work. It's for the cost of a missile, multiple millions. It's very cheap to repair a railway line. It's a couple $1,000 in a few hours. Ukraine has 200,000 railroad workers. This is the hidden army of Ukraine, right? They have thousands of people that can repair. And I've seen many reports from both sides that say, okay, using a caliber missile on some train tracks is not efficient. Maybe on a train station, but even there, it's complicated. It's much more complicated.
It's bridges. If the Russians are able, if the Russians wanted to stop supply and support from Western countries, they need to destroy the bridges over the.
And why hasn't this been done? Why? This is the big question.
Because they want to use them.
But no, because when the Russians retreated from Kherson, the first thing they did was to blow up the bridge. So thinking that the bridges will stand intact is fantasy. The Russians blew up all the bridges before retreating, and the Ukrainians did the same thing every time. It's the first thing you do as a sapper. Yeah. I mean, once you're done retreating, the sappers blow up the thing no matter what. So thinking that the Russians want to use it, it's fantasy.
No, what Alex is talking about.
Go ahead.
What Alex is talking about is, and a lot of people ask me this question all the time: how come Russia isn't destroying all of this equipment as it's coming into Ukraine? Why are they allowing it to reach the front line? Because while you could try to use, because at that range you're limited, the number of weapon systems that can precisely strike targets that deep into Ukraine, it's very limited. The number of opportunities are very limited. The closer they get to the front line, the more options in terms of weapons you have available, and the more opportunities you have to use them. It's much easier for Russia to destroy all of these weapon systems when they reach the front line. And the M1 Abrams would get destroyed just as quickly and easily as all of these other tanks that Ukraine has been using and losing. There's nothing special about an M1 Abrams tank. So they can send these tanks. They might make Russia fall back as they have been doing. They're averse to heavy losses, but they will eat up this force as they do, and then they will come back like they have been doing.
There's now that you said this, it makes me think that if Russia was to attack on a big scale, it wouldn't come from Belarus. I think the entire thing from Belarus is a non-issue. It's diversion, right? Mm-hmm. It's Zaporozhye, because this is where they can physically hold the bridges and hold the ground. And at the same time, Dima, can you show the Zaporozhye region, please? You see, this region, if they attack in this sector, it also helps them defend the area south of it. You see, if the Russians attack it gives them a bigger range of defense in case shit hits the fan. So I think the best defense is offense. And the question I have is that, so I think they're preparing something there. It would make sense, especially if you have a lot of armored units. The big question I have is, where are the Russian paratroopers from Kherson? We never hear about them since the withdrawal. And we know these guys are elite troopers. Where are these 30,000 paratroopers? If
What do
they're
you think?
somewhere,
You think it's Zaporozhye?
nobody knows. And that's what's scary. There's not a single report on Telegram, anything about paratroopers. We don't know where they are. And this is the scary part. I don't know.
If we are talking about the possible direction of Russian attack, when let's say the head of Ukraine army, who operates on the north of Ukraine on the border with Belarus, these days he gave some interesting interview, and he reported that there are a lot of forces on the territory of Belarus, but these forces are not able to let's say to achieve some strategic goal. For example, these forces are not able to get Zhytomyr, let's say, or these forces are not able to get, I don't know, Lvov in this direction to cut. But he noted that these forces are able to achieve some tactical goal. And you know that sometimes we discuss about the ground, about the army, but don't forget about the fact that Ukrainians attack and shell Donetsk heavily. For the last 2 weeks, the losses among civilians is around 300 people. So the Ukrainians attack this town using rockets, using artillery without even aiming. They're just attacking hospitals, marketplaces, and so on, and they're killing civilians. So by saying that the Russians are able to achieve some tactical goal on the north, I believe that he means that the Russians are able to get as close as possible to Kiev and to bring artillery to Kiev. So the distance between the Russian position and Kiev would be like something around 50 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers. And from this distance, the Russians will be able to do the same thing as the Ukrainians do in Donetsk. So to attack Kiev, and the most important, they will be able to force the Ukrainians to start negotiations.
Yeah, but I have a question. I don't know. Maybe I'm completely off the tracks, but is it really the only goal of the Russian armed forces right now to have retaliatory strikes on civilians in Kiev? Isn't it to destroy the armed forces? Don't you think that they would spend this energy destroying the army, the divisions, that would anyway push the political leadership of Ukraine into peace talks, because then they have no more army? And because if they want to do this, they can send caliber missiles into Kiev and do the same thing without even risking an invasion.
Caliber, as you told, caliber are very expensive, and the Ukrainians do have air defense, and not every single caliber are able to get Kiev. We can say that there are at least 3 goals that the Russians can have. The first one to destroy Ukrainian army. The second one to get some advantages on the ground, to take more territories. But I think that today the most important thing that the Russians need is to force the Ukrainians to start negotiation process.
But it's a problem. There's a problem here that the Russian leadership has made it very, very clear that they're not going to negotiate with the Zelensky regime. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
But can you show the Zaporozhye city? There's something I was wondering. Can you show?
This is Zaporozhye.
Okay, can you zoom in into the city? How many bridges are crossing over?
1.
3. 1, 2, and 3.
Can you show them? Here, there's 1 rail one and 2 normal ones.
1, 2, 3.
Okay, if the Russians, let's say, imaginary, okay, hypothesis, if the Russians are launching an operation against Zaporozhye, what happens if they get close and they destroy these bridges? How can you supply?
First of all, to destroy these bridges, the Russians, it's the same situation with deployment process. When the Ukrainians see that the Russians deploy their forces near Bakhmut, they move their forces there. If the Ukrainians see that the Russians attack these bridges, they will bring air defense system, and believe me, believe me, at this, we using calibers or Jaggers, it's highly unlikely that the Russians are able to destroy these bridges.
Okay.
I believe it's impossible. It's
the,
you need
the question, the question is not if possible or not, but how many would be necessary? How many are we talking about? 50, 100, 1,000? Let's put a number. Let's put a number. How many? Yeah.
Okay, so what would be the point of destroying the bridge? What's your points? Suppose that they destroy it. So what's your
okay?
point?
How do you?
They destroy it.
Okay, let's suppose they destroy it. How do you bring stuff across? We saw how painful it was in Kherson.
Through Dnipro, here, here, and then you're in Zaporozhye.
Yeah,
so,
but it would be a huge detour. It would be very complicated, especially if you have an attack from the south.
It's just 121 kilometers. It will take 2 hours for the railroad to do some kind of rotation or deployment. So it's not an option, to tell the truth.
But I don't understand. Because when we're talking about Bakhmut, you say, Ukrainian forces would have to do this hulk of 2 kilometers. It would complicate things. Already a little hulk of 2 kilometers. And it's just that I have a lot of questions. Just if they're already a little hulk of a couple kilometers can be problematic. Imagine 120 kilometers. You have to reroute everything. It's not that easy. I think it wouldn't be that easy.
Or to do what?
I think talking about these, as some people call them, big arrow offensives or movements.
We're tactical nerds, but
no, I'm just saying that
it's just questions.
Russia is setting out to destroy Ukraine's military. It's so much easier for them to place their forces at the gates of Bakhmut. Zelensky said it will not fall. And it's like a black hole sucking in the Ukrainian army, and Russia is just wiping them out as they come, and they're wiping them out. And
I agree.
This is ideal for Russia. They don't have to go deep into Ukraine. They're right there where their supply lines are. They're building up their forces to do something we don't know. I think the most conservative and safest play for Russia would to be just increase the pressure in exactly this way, this attrition that they're
Brian, I have a question.
On Ukraine.
Brian, Dima, I have a question. And do you guys think that, like, right now we're talking about Russian offensives? Do you think that Ukraine still has potential to attack in winter? There's some reports that say that Ukraine is keeping troops in reserve for some offensive. Do you think they could? And if yes, where?
Bakhmut. The Ukrainians accumulated a lot of forces near Bakhmut, and of course, in this area, they can start their own counteroffensive operation. Bakhmut.
So actually, it plays into the Russians' hands. I mean, if they're assembling their own reserves right there in Bakhmut, then all the Russians have to do is just wait and for these guys to show up, and they can smash them. I mean, it's just a meat grinder.
That's literally what they're calling it, a meat grinder. Yeah. Both sides,
and this is an option for the Ukrainians, because one of the most, that the main forces who is involved as the main forces that storm Bakhmut is Wagner PMC, right? And it's like kind of myth in this area, in this war. So the first thing you need to do with your enemy is to destroy his myth, like to show that you don't have anybody who is like, I don't know, who can't be killed. So Bakhmut is the best place for the Ukrainians to start counteroffensive operation. Of course, they will have a lot of losses, but they will prepare it and they will train for this big battle.
But if you're talking about losing, killed in action, you say it's like roughly a battalion. I mean, the Ukraine forces are not limitless, and all the estimates that are coming out are saying
the Russians are not limitless as well. The Russians are not limitless.
Yeah, but they have 500,000 men there. Whereas, according to reputable Western sources, Zaluzny, he himself said that they only have 200,000 combat men. So, I mean, it's not limitless.
But is it 200,000 active on the front or total?
Total.
The Russians, according at least 3 weeks ago, I got information that by the end of this year, the Russians are planning to deploy around 500,000 soldiers on the territory of Ukraine.
Well, no, right now, what they have on Belarus and here in Belgorod, across the border, and in the south, they have, as of 2 weeks ago, 540,000 men. So it's likely around 600,000 men at this time because they're shipping in people. So we're talking comfortably over 500,000. So please continue.
So the thing is that Bakhmut is the perfect place for both sides. And who wins this battle, or to tell the truth, who are able to reduce enemy's army more than this army are able to achieve success? I'm not even saying that the Bakhmut will be taken at all, because to tell the truth, these days, at least from my perspective, Marinka is much more important than Bakhmut. Bakhmut is some kind of media place.
Okay, why do you think that Marinka is more important?
Why? I'm curious.
Because these days, the most important thing is not to take Bakhmut, but to force and to push Ukrainian artillery from Donetsk. People are very tired in Donetsk. Every single day we have people are dying there. Civilians, just because of madness and targeted attacks from the Ukrainian side. They're just attacking with rockets, with artillery. So it's a very terrible situation. And for now, the Russians need to have a stable back. And Donetsk is a stable back, but people are tired there. And who says that tomorrow people from Donetsk won't raise and say, Russians, we're sick of you. Please go get out from these territories, because we want to start
human nature.
Process.
That's not human nature. The people
Everything
of
is
Donetsk are
possible.
not. No, well, yeah, everything is possible. A purple kangaroo can pop up on the stream, sure. But in as a practical, political, and human nature reality, the people of Donetsk blame the Zelensky regime for the shelling. They're never going to turn on the Russians and say, "Oh, we're sick of this shelling from the Zelensky regime. Why don't you guys leave?" No, that's just not I'm sorry, that's just not a human reality.
Anyway, okay, it's not a problem. Anyway, to push the Ukrainians from Donetsk is much more important than to take Bakhmut. And where you know that the biggest Ukrainian army is around Bakhmut. Like, there are a lot of forces, and you're attacking a very powerful defense fist, and it's like it's not even known that you are able to destroy this army. But there is a lot of goals that you need to achieve around Donetsk: to get control over Marinka, to get from Krasnogorovka, to take control over Avdiivka, and to stop this shelling over Donetsk. To stop
here's a supposition. Here's a supposition. Suppose in Bakhmut, the Russians all of a sudden started like pulling back. Would that lead the Zelensky regime forces to push forward and fall into like a trap of the Russians? Do you think that might be the play, seeing as Bakhmut has become so politically important to the Zelensky regime that they would say, "Oh, we're winning in Bakhmut," and just pour in even more soldiers and make it a killing field? Do any of you think that that's a possibility?
I don't.
I don't think so. I think that the Russians chose a very correct tactic. They brought as much as possible artillery to the front line, and they're just attacking the Ukrainians. The problem of Ukrainians on this front line is their powerful side is their weakest point, because now there are a lot of forces in Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka, Toretsk, Bakhmut. They're over concentrated. And over-concentrating means that the losses from artillery attacks is going to rise and going to be very big. So that's why the Ukrainians can't keep such a big army at one place without any activity. If they continue keeping their forces on the ground, pinned down to some towns, some buildings, they will have losses. They need to start some activity. They need to start counteroffensive operation, and they can do this. Furthermore, in my video, I told that Bakhmut is not the only place where the Ukrainians can start counteroffensive operation. A possible place where the Ukrainians can start offensive operation is a little bit to the south from Bakhmut in direction of Gorlovka, because if we are talking about Gorlovka, there is important railroad center like Debaltseva, this one that connects.
One question from the front line to where you're pointing to Dubgorka. What's the distance?
It's around from the Ukrainian position to the Russians. These two towns like very close to each other. Like there's front line between towns.
The lines that you've made, the two parallel lines that you've made. What's the distance?
20 kilometers. Between these 20 kilometers, the Ukrainians.
No, not between the parallel lines, but rather where they intersect with the front all the way to the town that you're
25 kilometers. 25.
kilometers.
Okay.
20 kilometers, and then the Ukrainians will be able to cut Donetsk from Lugansk. And by the way, in 2014, 2015, the battle for Debaltseve was one of the most important, because Debaltseve used to be under Ukrainian control during the first Ukrainian-Russian
Yeah,
war.
but the battle of this area, the Ukrainians were surrounded on the west, the east, and the south. So they were in some sort of pocket, but it was a completely different scenario. But the problem is with Donetsk is that it's heavily fortified and there's a lot of high ground. So it would be very difficult.
To tell the truth, I must say that there is no easy solutions.
There is no easy solution.
There's no easy solutions. If you want to win, you need to risk. Yeah. And the Ukrainians, they understand. You need to understand. They are over concentrated on this front.
Okay, let's step up back a little bit.
One thing.
Go ahead.
I just want to say that Dima is right from a strategic operational perspective. If Ukraine was to attack, this area would be very good for them. So yes, I just don't see it happening.
Let me step back. Let me step back here. Let's focus on the bigger picture so we understand. All this minutia is very interesting, but let's step back and ask the following questions. Number one, we all agree that this is an attritional war, correct? I mean, ultimately, this is what we're talking about. Brian, it's an attritional war, right?
Yes, and everyone at the political and military leadership of Russia says they are going to grind down Ukraine's military, and that is what we're watching in Bakhmut right now.
Okay, number one, it's an attritional war. Number two, I think that we're all in agreement with the numbers that the Zelensky regime forces are suffering at least a 5-to-1 ratio compared to the Russians. We're all in agreement with that. It could be higher, lower.
I can't say. I'm not sure about this. I can't agree with this because something tells me that.
But hang on. We're saying that the Zelensky regime is losing a battalion a day, and the Russians are certainly not losing that number of troops every day. And we know that the total, all Russians, I mean, DPR, LPR, Wagner, Chechens, everybody, and of course the Russian army, their KIAs are about 15,000 versus at least 100,000 on the Zelensky regime. So we can say ballpark figure that, yeah, it's about 1 to 5, 1 to 7. And it's an attritional war. The Zelensky regime is losing at least 1 to 5 or 5 to 1. And secondly, we know that from the mouth of General Zaluzny himself, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, that they have 200,000 men currently. And it's known for a fact that the Russians have at least 500,000. I mean, all this adds up that it's inevitable. I mean, the outcome of this is inevitable. Brian?
And Gonzalo, don't forget the situation in terms of weapons and ammunition. The West is tapping out on what they're able to send to Ukraine without resorting to completely extreme measures like, we're going to send our tankers in our tanks into Ukraine and pretend that the Ukrainians, which I think they will not be able to pass that on. That will not float. Even if they did, it still won't make any difference because they'll be back to where they were at the beginning of all of this when Ukraine had huge numbers of tanks and then Russia used its superiority in terms of artillery, missiles, military aviation to wipe them out.
I 100%
and Brian,
agree.
to follow up on your point, Brian, you would agree with me that if NATO were to send their own M1s Abrams tanks and jet fighters and what have you, the NATO commanders would be very, very concerned that their own armies would be degraded by throwing it into this grinder, and that perhaps they'd put up just not allow it to happen at all because they realize that they'd be just throwing away their tanks, their planes, and the men who operate them. Would that be correct, Brian?
That I'm not really 100% sure on. The thing that would make me feel more confident answering this is if I had solid numbers in terms of production, Russian military industrial production. If I knew that they were still churning out X number of tanks, missiles, anti-tank systems, if I knew that they were able to continuously put this out despite the sanctions, and then NATO is talking about getting involved, I would feel very confident about answering that in terms of in favor of Russia.
Okay,
But
I'm
so
not
what,
sure.
but what we
Yeah.
stand right now, insofar as the numbers, the end seems inevitable. I mean, doesn't it?
I
Yes.
think we all agree here in terms of the general idea of what's going on. I think we pretty much have the same understanding. This is why we have this talking about details, because this is where we might disagree, but overall we all agree about the balance of power and everything. Now the only thing is that there's the big strategy where we agree on, and then there is the how is going to happen
Mhm.
that we might question, because yes, we say, yeah, the Russians have this and that. For now, the thing, from what I see in the map, we don't know the concentration of forces of the Russian army. We have an idea of the Ukrainian army, where they're positioned. We don't know very much about the concentration of forces on the Russian side. So if they were to launch an offensive, the question is where. So this is more Dima and my sector on YouTube. We talk about these military stuff. This is our thing, to
Alex,
know
I
where.
would like to add one important note to your words. We don't know, but believe me,
Yeah,
NATO
yeah,
and the
yeah,
Ukrainians
yeah,
they
yeah,
know exactly where
yes,
the
of
Russians
course.
are.
Yes, yeah. We don't know as analysts. We don't have the equipment, but they do know these numbers. They have the satellites. They have the imagery, and because of this fact that NATO has an all like eye of Sauron, like an eye of Sauron, they know everything. They can see, right? You cannot fool them. So this is why I think that there is not going to be an attack from somewhere unexpected, because
Yeah.
they will know immediately. So I think the attack.
Yeah.
So I think if the Russians were to attack, it would just be pushed more from where they're already attacking. And I think they understood that fooling NATO satellites is not working. That's why they're just using brute force in Donbass. I think this is just going to be a slow grind, and there's not going to be any surprises, in my opinion.
I agree with that, Alex. I just also want to point out that knowing the disposition of troops is extremely important. This is why I made a mistake regarding Kharkov, because I didn't know that. I didn't know what the disposition of Russian troops were in that area. If I had known that, I would say they seem like they've given up on that area, and they are willing to give it up.
And Brian, you're right. You're 100% right. And this is where I find that there's the map of deployment map from military land very, very misleading, because they did not show the concentration of Ukrainian forces before the Kharkov offensive. They showed Ukrainian units, the Ukrainian units that took part in this offensive, they showed them in Donbass. They showed them all over the front. So either they did not know, or there's something where they're not saying, because out of a sudden Ukraine concentrated 10,000 men. So
no, Alex, I can't agree with you. Because if you remember,
we look at the map before, the battalions were in Bakhmut.
I remember that was the roundtable with you. Maybe you weren't. You didn't took part in, but we discussed, and I told you at that video, right, like in 2 or maybe before the Ukrainian start offensive operation in Kharkiv area. I told guys, maybe you were there, that the Ukrainians, I believe, are planning to start offensive operation in Kharkiv because and that information I found on deployment map, that the Ukrainians deployed at least 4 mechanized brigade, 1 tank brigade, and at least 2 air assault brigade in Kharkiv area. Yes, and to tell the truth, there was 14th mechanized, there was the 17th, not first tank brigade, there was 79th Mechanized Brigade, 81st AT's Air Assault Brigade. So all these brigades who later took part in offensive operation in Kharkiv, they were deployed according to deployment map in Kharkiv area. So I can't tell you that we didn't know. At least I analyzed information, and at least from my side, I saw this attack.
I hadn't been paying very close attention to those details because I tried to look at the bigger picture. But I do distinctively remember on Telegram many channels that I follow that I find reliable talking about a buildup of Ukrainian forces around Kharkov for an offensive. I remember that. And then when it happened, I was kind of shocked that Russia I just assumed that Russia gave up on that area. They had no intention of holding it.
When the Ukrainians started offensive operation, everybody wasn't shocked because the Ukrainians started offensive operation. Everybody was shocked because there were no Russians in this area.
Exactly.
They pulled out.
Exactly. Yeah.
That was the shock for everybody. Where is the Russians?
Except the Duran. I think Alexander Mikurs actually talked about how it looked like Izium, they had divested from it, and then it turned out he was right. They really had no real presence there anymore, and it was a process. And let's talk about that, because I think that's interesting. Russia, it admittedly was overextended. Their troops were spread out thin. They knew this. This is why they called up the mobilization. That's what happens when you're spread out thin. You have the area where you're focused, and then you have these places where you're being pushed back on the map. This is happening to Ukraine right now, where we're told that they turned the tide and they're on the offensive, but now they're losing, very important, maybe small but important towns and cities here and there. Why is that? Because now they're spread thin. What are they going to do to address that? Do they have a 300,000 reservists force to call up?
Very interesting point about why the Russians lost Kharkov battle and what the problems with Ukrainians these days. As you know, when the Russians started their special operation, they tried to sign short-term contracts, 3 months and 6 months contracts. And if we calculate the time between February, we can add 6 months, we'll see that a lot of contracts have expired in August and September, right exactly at the time when the Ukrainians started the offensive operation. And it's true. A lot of people, after their contract expired, decided to leave Ukraine because they saw a lot. They suffered a lot, and a lot of soldiers left, volunteers, they left the front line. And the Russians, from one side, they understand that they don't have soldiers, they need to start mobilization, and exactly at that moment the Ukrainians use this situation because they understand that a lot of contracts expired and they start offensive operation because of lack of soldiers. And today 100%. We see the same situation from the Ukrainian side, because these days a lot of Ukrainians who were mobilized are in United Kingdom, in Spain, in Germany, in Romania. They're under training process, that. So they are not on the front line. We can say that Ukraine have a very big army, but a big part of this army is in Europe. And the Russians activated their offensive operation exactly at the time when the most of the Ukrainian army is not in Ukraine.
Hang on a second, Dima. Those troops, and this is from sources in the West, say that those troops in a lot of these training stations, at least in the United Kingdom, these are green conscripts that have zero military experience beforehand. So the notion that
there's not that many of them.
No, but exactly. What he means is that they're not in the front line. Is that they're away? Yeah. Is that they're not in Ukraine?
Also, the other issue, number one, they're green, and the trainers, the British trainers, are saying that these guys are green, that they don't know anything about soldiering. Number one, and number two, the numbers are less than in total that are being trained outside of Ukraine. What? Maybe 5,000? Okay, say 10,000. Is that going to make a lick of difference when you're losing
United Kingdom, Romania, Poland, Germany, Spain? I believe 40,000 we are able to calculate. But this is not the most important. About the Green Army. After 1991, the Ukrainians decided not to have army at all. So the Ukrainians restored their military forces just in 2014. So everybody in Ukraine are green. So there are no professionals, because just 8 years ago.
Yeah, well, the ones that were professional in February of this year, they have all been pretty much wiped out. And so what you have, you see the video, you're seeing old men, guys, younger than me, but they're in their 40s and early 50s. Okay, you see them and you see that they are just in no shape at all to be fighting. And yet there they are in some trench in the middle of nowhere.
That's an interesting topic. It's a bit unrelated, but a little parenthesis for a couple of seconds. I think it's very interesting to this Ukraine war too, because it shows that you don't need 18-year-old guys to go to war. And I think, especially in the modern day and age, you can have older men. Look at the Russian people that were mobilized, mid-30s. How old do you have to be a tank driver? You don't need to be bench pressing your body weight 10 times, right? You just need to be able to drive a tank. Same thing for artillery shells. I think being young or not is not necessary these days. And this is very interesting
I
for
disagree. I disagree.
Yeah,
As a
I
54-year-old
mean,
man, I can tell you.
I was in the military. I was in an artillery unit. That is, it's heavy duty work, and you got to be in
Yes,
pretty good
but
shape to do it.
I-
And the physical fitness of, say, an artillery team will have a direct impact, especially in the type of conditions in Ukraine where it is an artillery war. They're not doing fire missions like once or twice a day in Afghanistan. This is constant.
So why has Russia mobilized men that are in their 30s and not 18-year-olds?
Because all of them
Because
were already served. That's what got
reservists.
mobilized.
I mean, 30
but
30
you can be
is still
21.
30 is still okay. I mean, if they're 50 or 60, then that is a huge problem. If you're 50
I agree.
and 60,
I can tell you, as
you're not-
a 54-year-old man, once you hit like roughly 37 to 43 in that range, your physical capacity just goes off a cliff. I mean, it just does.
Unfortunately,
yeah. And Brian is 40, so he knows what I'm talking about. It really goes off a cliff. Okay, I mean, it's just an inevitability of aging. And so the so-called conscripts the Russian called up, which were not conscripts, they were all people who had previous military experience, and I know a few of them directly, so I know what I'm talking about. These guys, they were all under 35. Kind of like tops, and they had an age cutoff, but I actually have forgotten what that age cutoff was.
And talking about conscripts, it's a good leap into the topic that Russia has called up two waves of actual conscripts this year, in April and in fall. And my question is, what are they going to do with them at the end of their contract? I don't know, perhaps Dima has more information about it, but the guys that came in April, 200,000 guys, what's going to happen to them once they're done? Are they going to join the Russian military? Are they going to be released?
When the Russians adopt all the necessary laws for mobilization, one of the things they adopted is that nobody these days can be released or returned back home, even if their contract ends until the end of special operation. So for now, there is no way to get out of special operation for the Russians. It's like if you ever sign a contract, so you won't be able to finish
for
the
life.
contract.
Yeah.
Until the end of special operation.
What about conscripts? Because there's Russians signing contracts. There's also Russians that are conscripted. From my and I could be wrong. This is why I'm asking, genuinely asking. If you're conscripted, are you still just going to serve your minimum time, drive trucks or whatever in the rear, and then finish your contract, or not contract, but your conscription?
The previous week there was a very interesting situation. One of the military authorities from Russia, he was interviewed, and people asked him questions about the next year, about the plans and so on, and he said that those guys who will join army in April will serve not a year but a year and a half, and those guys who will join army in September in the fall of next year will serve not a year and a half, but 2 years. I think that it was his mistake. I don't think he should have said that, but it was his mistake. He did this. Later, this video was updated. The military authorities said that it was a fake. It's not the truth. But I believe that yes, the next year the Russians are planning to increase the term of serving in the military. Now this term is 1 year. I believe that they will increase the term up to 2 years. So just like during the special operation, maybe after special operation, they will reduce this term to 1 year again.
So that means that Russia, in theory, might have 200,000 more men by April with 1 year of training. Correct? Or am I missing something?
Please, can you give more details? I don't understand exactly what you're asking.
Okay. Like the conscripts, the guys that came in, the young guys that came in April of this year, the 200,000 men that went, the young men that went to military service. By April 2023, it will be 1 year. Technically, can they be sent to Ukraine or not?
No, they can't. They can't be sent.
Okay,
the Russians use conscript army just for defense. They're not using them to on the territory of other countries. Just the forces who signed the contract or mobilized can be sent on the territory of
But now
Ukraine.
that
There's something else I
Donbass-
want to point out. There's
but
something
hold
else I
on,
wanna-
just one
Go
thought.
ahead.
Just the fact that the regions now are officially part of Russia, can these conscripts be sent to Donbass now,
No.
since these are officially part of Russia?
No.
Can these conscripts be sent there?
Yes,
Because
they
it's
can.
technically self-defense.
Technically, yes, they can. Technically,
Okay.
yes, they can, because it's a part of Russian Federation. Of
Okay,
course.
okay, that's all I wanted to know. So technically, they could be involved. Okay, that's all I wanted to. Okay, sorry.
No, there's something else too. You know, the Russians have said that they called up 300,000 men and they got another 70,000 odd volunteers. All of these people had previous military training and experience, and they'd served their 2 years. It was basically calling up the National Guard, equivalent in the United States. But the actual number, as I understand it, Dean, and correct me if I'm wrong, the actual number in the decree was actually censored. And I've always had the suspicion that the Russians called up a lot more than 300,000. The reason being is that in my circle of acquaintances, a lot of people were saying that either they themselves or people they knew had been called up, that it seemed disproportionate to the pool of people. And I find it surprising that I would just happen to know people in Russia who, of course, speak English because I don't speak Russian, and they're very educated, so it's a very relatively small group, that they would have so many of their own peers that were called up. Do you think that it's possible that it's not really 300,000 that they called up, that it's a lot more?
Yes, it is possible, because don't forget about police forces, about as one of our speakers told about the Ukrainian railroad, number of employees in the railroad, a lot more. I believe that a lot more from different kind of Wagners. Don't forget about Wagners. Wagners are not included in the number of the Russian forces who were deployed on the territory of Ukraine. Don't forget about any other private campaigns. These numbers are not included. So a lot more.
Yeah. Well, okay. So stepping back, let's assume for the sake of argument that at some point over the next, let's say, month, okay, Bakhmut falls. At some time by mid-January, Bakhmut falls. Brian, what do you think the reaction in the West would be to that? Do you think that that would be the moment that they decide to turn their back on Ukraine, on the whole Ukraine project?
I mean, at best, the West would divest from it because this is their project. This isn't something Ukraine is doing that they're helping out with. This is their project that they are carrying out using Ukraine. And I don't think so. But they will probably do the same thing they did when Lysychansk and Severodonetsk were captured by Russia. They will do the same thing. They will dismiss it as irrelevant, and they will just carry on as if nothing happened. I think it's not just going to end with the fall of Bakhmut. If it falls, there's a giant hole in this main defensive line that Ukraine has created. They're going to have to rework their defensive lines, which is not an easy thing to do on short notice. They're probably already trying to work on it right now. And Russia will be able to attack in different directions that they are not as well prepared for. And this is the same thing that happened with Pavasnaya. They punched a hole through there, and then they were going in all different directions. And Ukraine was not able to stop them until they reached the next main defense line. I think something similar will happen. And let's just try to think about how the West will spin this in terms of narrative. We were told that Ukraine was on the offensive. They're going to get their everything back. Russia is done. And then this happens. How are they going to explain that? And what will they try to do if they're tapped out in terms of resources? What will they do to escalate? Because as many people point out, they have no reverse gear.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just pause a little bit, and I'm going to bring on some Patreon supporters. And if you're a Patreon supporter and listening in, now is the time we'll take some Q&A. I'm bringing on Pamela. Pamela, how's it going? Good to hear from you.
Good. How are you? Can you
Doing
hear me?
very well. What's your question? Yes, we hear you loud and clear. What's your question?
Okay. Recently, I read or heard on one of the podcasts that, and I'm interested in everyone's opinion on this, that Ukraine is focusing on Donetsk and the Donbass region because they want to kill everybody over there, civilians, whatever, because that takes away Russia's argument for even being in this conflict at all. You know, it's for public consumption. And we know that the US and NATO and, you know, everybody wants Russia's resources, but do you think there's any validity to that? That they're just going to focus on them?
That they're trying to genocide all the people in
Yes, and then they can take away Russia's argument for saying they're over there to rescue these people.
Well, actually, it would prove their point now, wouldn't it? If the Zelensky regime is trying to genocide all the people in southern Ukraine, then that would precisely prove the Russians' point. Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I know what Pamela's talking about. They're undermining the narrative that Russia is there to protect the Russian-speaking Ukrainian population, now part of Russia. And I do believe that that's what they're thinking when they're just sending missiles and rockets into Donetsk city. This is the reason why, is to undermine. But just as Gonzalo pointed out, the people living there understand that there is no alternative. It's either Russia or oblivion. They know that. So this is desperate, dangerous, desperate, and just completely criminal on Ukraine's side. It's not going to work out the way they think it's going to, but this is what desperate opponents do when they're in the corner like this. Germany used to do things like this in World War II, just lashing out in any way that they can, because they can't do anything of substance on the battlefield anymore.
It appears to be their strategy in one respect, and I think it's valid. I mean, as far as like, they're controlling the narrative in the West, as we know, and people like us don't buy into it, but you know, the lemmings do. So I don't know. It's horrible, but I mean, I don't know. Do you think that's gonna work? You don't think it'll work?
No, I don't think that it'll work. Yeah,
not at all.
It's also something that the West, it's also something that the West tries to pretend is not happening. When you see in reports, they're like, Donetsk was hit by rockets. They don't say who did it. They're acting as if it's like rain. It's like a rainstorm.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, great show, fellas.
Thanks very much for coming on, Pamela. I appreciate it. Yeah, you know, the West is just completely ignoring the Donetsk atrocities, because it is an atrocity. And the Duran has pointed out, the guys, Alexander Mercouris and Alex Christoforou, that whenever there is a military setback for the Zelensky regime, they lash out all the harder at Donetsk. And nobody in the West is reporting this at all. I mean, it is the silence is deafening.
Yeah.
What do you guys think?
I think that if the Russians wins, it will be a genocide. It will be called in the future of Donbass. The winners are writing the history, so the Russians will call this as a genocide, and they will judge the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainian wins, they will call this, I don't know, liberation, something like this. But if we're talking about the facts, there are a lot of authorities from Ukrainian side who said that let's kill the Donbass, let's kill the Russians in Donbass, let's kill their children, let's kill their kids. And Zelensky himself said something like this, that if you want to survive, you need to take your families, your kids, and get out from Ukraine. So it looks like genocide. If we're talking about the numbers of losses among civilians in Ukraine, in Donbass, it's not a genocide as we saw during the Second World War in Armenia and something like this. But if we are talking about the facts, about the things that we see, about the words that authorities are saying, it's a genocide.
It's similar to Yugoslavia. It is similar to Yugoslavia in a way.
Yes, a lot of similar things with Yugoslavia. I completely agree with you.
Yeah. Let me bring on Bob Hershaft. Bob, how's it going?
Oh, pretty good, thanks. I'm curious.
Glad you joined us.
I'm curious about what you gentlemen might think about the Helmer thesis, the idea of a swift move to the Dnieper and then withdrawal, creating a buffer zone and putting in some programmable mines that can be commissioned and decommissioned. I don't know whether this technology exists, but according to Helmer, it sounded like he had an inside source. I believe he's a Moscow correspondent.
Yeah, by the way, for people who don't know in the chat, John Helmer writes a blog, a very famous blog called Dancing with Bears. He is in Moscow. He's the longest serving foreign correspondent, Western correspondent in Moscow. He's been there for like 30 years. And he has a lot of very, very good input from, and I mean, he's very connected insofar as context within the various parts of Russian bureaucracy. So he's saying, Bob, can you fill us in exactly what Helmer is saying?
Oh, well, he was talking about a swift move across to the Dnieper, creating a buffer zone. In other words, it sort of negated any idea that the Russians were going to occupy the land, and they were no longer interested in capturing cities outright. It would be up to the people to revolt, and whether they were to be with them to decide. So they would be laying these programmable mines down and a quick action, and these could be activated or deactivated at any by some kind of technology.
Okay,
and
that I have never heard of such mining technology. Maybe it exists, but that's not the issue. Brian, what do you think of this creation of a buffer zone that Helmer is postulating?
I think it's a lot harder to do than to say they're going to do it. I think we could see, since this all began in late February, I can't rule it out. I don't sit in at the Russian General Staff's meetings, but I honestly believe that they are going to continue just grinding down the Ukrainian military. I think the idea of rushing across Ukrainian-held territory is extremely dangerous, risky. They will lose men and equipment no matter how well it turns out. They will lose more men and equipment doing that than this process of grinding down the military. Once Ukraine's military reaches a certain point, and things are going to start collapsing, and I think that's what they're waiting for. That's just my personal analysis on this, looking at what I'm seeing.
Dima, Alex, what do you guys think?
I know that if you want to understand the special operation and if you want to understand the Russians, first of all, we need to understand the head of the Russians, and I'm talking about Putin, right? Putin is a judo fighter. If you know what does it mean, judo, maybe I hope you know this, judo. So as you understand, and he's a very good fighter. He's a very nice, he has a lot of experience in judo. He's a well-trained person. He spent a lot of time in his life trying to investigate and learn this philosophy. And according to judo philosophy, we can say that you need to spend as less as possible energy and to achieve as much as possible effect. So this is the same philosophy of special operation, because he's the head of this operation, we can say, and he tries to run this operation as he understands the philosophy and the reality. And the only aggressive reality he knows is judo. So he wants to spend as less as possible energy to achieve as much as possible result. That means that if it's possible not to take entire Ukraine, not to cross Ukraine from Kharkiv to Lvov, if it's possible just to take one Bakhmut and to force the entire Ukraine to collapse, he will stop exactly at this moment, because this is his philosophy. Why do we need to cross to ruin the entire country? For what reason? If you can just...
But there's one problem. Yeah. There's one problem with that, though, is that if the Zelensky regime collapses, the Ukrainian armed forces just collapse, there will be a huge power vacuum. And it will have to be filled by somebody, either the Russians or by NATO.
It will be filled by the Russians anyway. It will be filled by the Russians, but But it's completely different. It's not a war. It's already a diplomacy and a policy. It's not like a war. So it will be a different sphere, different actions, different things in this case. There are a lot of people who support the Russians in Ukraine, and even today there are a lot of people who want to speak Russian, who want to have peace, no war, and something like this.
But what about the programmable minds? Is this a technology that exists? It just
I don't think any of us knows.
You know, Bob. If we can see drones like Shahed, there we can say that like it's a programmable flying mines. So I believe that there are technology to use mines because they don't need to move, of course, and there are a lot of them. And everybody has programmable mines. It's not difficult to do, but I'm not sure that everybody has the enough of the real quantity to use such a big number of mines to create a buffer. You need thousands of them, maybe millions, to create a buffer using these mines, and it's a very expensive technology. If we are talking about some certain front line, let's say somewhere around Avdiivka, at small point of front line, yes, it's possible to use, because at least the cost of these mines and the value that you are able to achieve is comparable. But if we're talking about thousands of kilometers, of hundreds, highly unlikely that anybody are going to use such technology. But this technology exists.
Okay, Bob, does that answer your questions?
Helmer seemed to be saying that these would be buried mines, and that
we're gonna have to move on, Bob, because we have other people that we want to bring on. But we hope that this answered your question. I don't mean to cut you off, but the issue of mines is really beyond our area of purview at this time. So, Bob, thank you so much for your support. Take it easy. My personal thinking is that insofar as the conflict is concerned, I do believe that there will be a sudden collapse, sort of like at the end of the U.S. Civil War or at the end of the First World War, where one side just threw in the towel because they were done. And I do not believe that there's going to be like street to street, block by block fighting in Kiev like there was in Berlin.
They're going to be collapsed sooner or later, in a month, in a year. They're going to be collapsed from one or another side, or the Russians or the Ukrainians. And mainly, we are talking not about the army. I think that the Ukrainians and the Russians armies are not going to collapse. They have reserves, they have supports. I believe that society of Ukrainians or the Russians sooner or later will collapse. Or the Russians, I'm talking about as soon as every single friend, family will receive some kind of note about the fact that their relatives were killed on the war. As soon as this situation will concentrate it in society, sooner or later, or the Ukrainians or the Russians will collapse.
Yeah. So, Alex, you're history legends. It says it right in the title. And I've followed your content for quite a while, and you have great content insofar as past battles are concerned and past wars. So, compared to other wars, do you think it's going to be a sudden collapse or block by block?
Right now I'm actually reading about the Russian Civil War, and it's very interesting. The after the Russian Revolution.
Okay, okay.
So in 100 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's very interesting because the root of the war in Ukraine now is you can see it there because the fighting is in the same areas, and you already saw the differences between the urban areas that were Russian, that were pro-Bolshevik in a lot of cases, and the fields that were less pro-Bolshevik, right? And the cities were more Russian, more pro-Bolshevik. All right. Now, when we see the war, it's very complicated to talk about wars and compare them, right? I can only compare conflicts that happened in the past years where the attacker had more firepower and was inflicting devastating losses on the defender. So I think we're in a similar scenario. Now, from a more political, strategic perspective, Ukraine has always been a terrain where there's a lot of movement from one side to another. It's the war we see now. Since already in the Russian Revolution, it goes from one end, it goes to the other end, and it's really, like Dima said, there's it's who holds the longest, who's the toughest in terms of planning and in terms of long-term strategy. I think this one will win the war. Now, the problem I see for Ukraine is that since 2014, they haven't evolved their military industry. What have they done with the money? They were still buying parts from Russia. They were still buying parts from Russia until the Russian invasion. They did not. They lost a lot of factories in Donbass. Why didn't they build new ones? So now they're waking up to their own mistakes. They could have built a new industry and actually defend themselves. Now they depend on the West. And that's the problem. When your independence depends on the goodwill of another country, you're in deep trouble. You know, like when you're financially dependent of someone else, you can only be that nice, but that person might one day cut you off. What do you do then?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think in the long term, the fact that Russia produces its own stuff, they can buy
everything.
They produce everything. So they can buy materials from any country and produce it. Ukraine cannot. They depend on other countries, even for repairs. Most of its stuff is repaired in Poland and Czech Republic and everything. So we see where it's going. When one country has the independence of its means and deploys everything how they want to do it, for Ukraine, it's going to be tough. They're on life support. They're on life support.
Yeah, but don't the Russians depend on Iran? I'm sorry, Brian.
Just to add on to what Alex was saying.
And last word, sorry, Brian. And to come back to the Russian Revolution, you see that, like Dima said, a lot of people in Ukraine are secretly supporting the Russians or favoring them. But if they speak up, they're against the wall. During the Russian Civil War, you could be shot just by being suspected to be one side or another. You know, one day the town is Bolshevik, so all the Tsarists are against the wall, and the next day the Tsarists take over the city, and anyone suspected to be a Bolshevik is shut down. So people shut up. In these areas of the world, people don't show their emotions. They don't show who they support. Because anyone that showed their support, historically speaking, has been killed. So the ones that make up the most part of the population are very good at camouflaging their true intentions. And
Brian?
It's been the same during the Soviet era.
Brian?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Alex was saying, because I think it's a good point. Ukraine not investing in its military industrial complex to defend itself. But the whole thing is this leadership that did all of this. I mean, if you had really good leadership, there would be nothing you would have to defend yourself against, because you would never have created this problem with Russia in the first place. You would have continued cooperating with them and also with the West, which is what Ukraine was doing until the US overthrew the government. I just want to go back to what Bob was saying about these programmable mines. I looked up John Helmer's website, and they're talking about mines that are launched by rockets, and you can program them to do different things. I do know that the U.S. has mines that you can fire from artillery, and they will self-destruct.
Everybody has, even Ukrainians. They use a distance method of mining of Donetsk.
Yeah, and they'll self-destruct in 2 days or deactivate in 2 days. So something like this is possible, but to create a giant demilitarized zone will take huge amounts of time. And I don't know if they have enough of these programmable mines. So I mean, like certain specific areas like Dimo's talking about, you could do that just to tie that issue up.
Well, my thinking insofar as going back to the whole issue of a buffer zone is that it seems to me that the Russians have made up their minds, that the collective leadership of Russia has made up its mind, especially considering the popular support it enjoys currently, that they're going to have to take over the whole country, all of Ukraine, up to the Polish border. And then they'll just carve it up. And I think that there's going to be a landlocked rump Ukrainian state that will have some regime installed that is going to be very docile and very friendly to Russia. And this landlocked Ukraine state is going to be extraordinarily poor because there's going to be no industry. The agriculture in that area, in the west of Ukraine, between Lviv and Kiev, is not as rich as the famous black soil of the south of Ukraine, which is currently under dispute. So ultimately, it's going to be a very, very poor backwater that is going to be severely depopulated because so many of the Ukrainians have left. I mean, it's credibly estimated that a third of the population has fled the country, and most of those people are not coming back. Something like it's estimated that about 4 million have gone to Russia and another 11 million have gone to the West. The numbers fluctuate, but it doesn't really matter. In the end, it's a third of your population gone for good. And they're not coming back even if there's peace, and certainly not to a poor, backward little buffer state. And I unfortunately think that that's going to be the fate of Ukraine. Do you guys agree with this, like, I suppose, long-term view as to the fate of this entire nation?
I think it'll be something. I think it'll be something along those lines. There will be a very diminished Ukraine left over. It'll possibly be landlocked, but that remains to be seen. There's always the possibility that Russia, not by choice, but by necessity, would freeze the conflict by time. To prepare for the next, just like they did kind of in 2014, 2015. But
yeah, but
I don't think
at this point.
Well, I mean, we don't
anything
really
can
know.
happen, sure.
Yeah,
but I mean,
exactly.
They don't seem that they're lacking in stuff, so that they need to freeze it to like rebuild, more artillery pieces or more tanks or whatever.
Yeah. So I mean, just one of the many possibilities. But I do agree that it'll. Russia is not going to want to settle for something less than just a very, very diminished, rump state, basically landlocked rump state. I think that would be ideal for them, if not the whole thing. Gone. Ukraine gone. Politically.
Oh boy. Let's bring on the Spy Guy, who's a long-term supporter of my Patreon. Spy Guy, how's it going?
Okay, how are you?
Pretty good. Thanks for coming on, man, and thank you for your support. So what do you want to ask the gentleman here?
Well, I just wanted, I was a little shocked. I was listening to you guys earlier talking about why the West doesn't send their tanks to Ukraine, and there's a very big reason they don't, and it's called autoloaders. Also, the Eastern tanks, the Soviet tanks that we're all basing the Ukraine and Russians are fighting with, they use autoloaders. In the West, they don't. So you have to retrain your entire tank crew for this extra man that you're going to have to use in the Western tanks. And that is the number one reason. They haven't sent any, along with Brian's point about all the logistics, you won't have that's the reason. You have to completely change the culture. Having driven a tank once in Vegas, I know how cramped these things are. And you're adding an extra man, you have to relearn all your skills. And that's the reason why they're not one of the major reasons why they're not sending in the tanks. I was at a conference a few years ago about war in the megacities with the American MIC and a lot of Western guys. And I can tell you the reason they're not, Russians will take the cities last is also logistics. Every major city is a huge logistical drain on Ukraine's capability to support them. You got to spend more money on pensions and all that stuff. And when the Russians take those cities, they lose. The Russians now have to pay for them. So that's why Russia's going to take the cities, among other reasons, is why the Russians will take those cities last. They're just huge logistics hubs. So anyways, that's what I wanted to say. And I got to get back to work. So I'll let you go and talk to the rest of your callers.
Thanks very much for joining, man.
I like the 1990s talk radio audio.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the fun things about these kinds of shows, of having different people on and just getting what they think. Let me bring on another person real quick. Dan, how's it going? Are you there? Dan, are you there? Hello, Dan. Dan is getting.
I can hear you.
Dan, are you there? Go ahead.
I'm here. I wanted to ask, how many active Russian troops are there? Do you know?
Yeah, at least 540,000 as of 12 days ago.
And how many of those are infantry, like trained to fight?
That I would not know. Dima, would you happen to know that figure?
Can't tell you. Infantry, that mechanized and motorized and tank brigades, artillery, who to calculate?
How much money do these guys in the like,
around $3,000 per month?
$2,000 US per month?
Yes, the salary of mobilized soldiers is around approximately $3,000 per month.
Okay, is the Russian army like the United States Army? Like, okay, if you're in the National Guard, what do you got to do? Like, make an 8-year commitment? Like, how much commitment do these guys?
What's the point that you're trying to make?
Well, I'm just trying to make to see what. Like, I know the Russians have a lot of fighters, but are they good fighters? Or like, and who is this Wagner Group? Who are these guys?
Well, the Wagner Group are basically private military contractors, mercenaries. A lot of them are washed up former military men who got kicked out for whatever reason, disciplinary reasons, whatnot, and they were scooped up by Wagner. They're highly trained, highly motivated, very, very good fighters. And now Dima did a couple of videos, I remember a few weeks ago, about how they are recruiting among prisons now. Basically, they're creating their own Saurukar. If anybody knows Stormtroopers. What? I'm sorry?
They're creating stormtroopers with prisoners.
And who command are they under? The Surovikin?
No. Well, now they are. Now under the unified command, they're under Surovikin. Yes.
So he's in charge of Wagner, so he can tell these guys from Wagner what to do?
Of course.
Yeah, he is telling them what to do.
Wagner's not independent. They're part of the Russian troops, you know. They're semi-independent, you know. They can attack here and there, but just see it as another unit that has a fancy outfit, but they cannot say whatever, they cannot do whatever they want.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. Okay, let me, my final question is this. How do you think this war can stop? I mean, if Ukrainians are getting slaughtered, I don't understand how the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church can't get together and have peace. Like, why are these churches against each other? Like the Pope, like what's the problem with the Pope and the Patriarch in Russia? Like, I
don't think that's playing much of a role in this particular conflict. I think that in this role, religion, though it's very important to many people, insofar as this conflict is concerned, it's a purely political matter. Because so this war is not going to end because of the religious leadership, noble as those efforts may be.
Dan, don't forget that these people used to be communists not too long ago. So anyway, religion, you know, it's not as deep as for other parts. So they were part of.
To tell the truth, I can't agree with you. I completely agree with Dan. Religion plays the major, maybe one of the major roles in this conflict, because it's a very big money. First of all, it's completely two different influence centers: Moscow, Constantinople, and Rome. And so it's very important. I can't tell you the real what is the correlation between these two things, but the religion plays a significant role in this conflict, of course.
I can also say on the ground experience that many people here in Ukraine are extremely religious. And so
the Russians as well. The Russians like fanatic religious. A lot of people are there.
It's not like Western Christianity, which is now sort of like a like dressage. It's not serious. Over here, they take it seriously. Brian?
I would also say that the root of this problem is Washington transforming Ukraine into a proxy to create a national security threat on Russia's border. So the Roman Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church can get together and talk all they want, but unless somehow they can yank on the leash of Washington, it's going to make no difference. And because that is
the Ukrainians have their own Orthodox Church. So, and there is a very big conflict between these two churches.
And they're essentially Catholics, right? Like it's very
come
close.
on, I'm Catholic. Be careful there.
Yeah, but no, but it's closer. The rights of the rights of the Ukrainians is closer to Catholics, from what I know. Maybe I'm wrong.
I'm not that familiar with it, to tell you the truth.
Pope of Rome. Okay, so the Ukrainian Catholic Church, okay, for some reason they follow the Pope of Rome.
Okay,
but I don't think that religion is the center core of this war. Yeah, it has a part of it, but it's not the factor.
Okay,
it's Washington's proxy war, and so you have to deal with Washington. Washington is the problem. Washington is not interested in negotiating. They are trying to protect their primacy over the planet, and that is what this is a part of. It's also why there's this tension between the U.S. and China. It's all part of the same problem. So
what you're saying, Brian, is Washington's a secular, or the United States is a secular country that does not give a shit about religion.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Guys, I have one question to you. Do you know who is Vanga?
No.
No. Nobody knows who is Vanga.
No.
Bulgarian woman who did a lot of prophecy in the 20th century. He gave a lot of things that, and she's very famous. You can Google her. She gave a lot of projections, and a lot of them took place in the past and so on. And one of her prophecy was that after brother attacks the brother, three Slavic sister will create a very powerful Slavic country.
Wow.
And this war is a war between three Slavic sisters, three Slavic countries: Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. This is three Slavic countries. And in the past, these three Slavic countries, people created USSR. If you remember, after the revolution and so on, and 100 years ago, these three countries signed a contract and created USSR. And in 1991, these three Slavic countries destroy USSR together the same way. So this war, also the war of prophet of this woman Vanga, she gave. You can read this in internet, and I'll repeat one more time that three countries, three Slavic nations will fight, and she told that the one nation who is less powerful will give up, will surrender, and after a lot of blood, a lot of war, these three Slavic nations will create a powerful Slavic country that will ruin the rest of the world, or something like this. So this is very interesting because it shows and explains a lot during these days.
Baba Vanga is the name of the prophet, I believe. Dan, thank you so much for joining. I hope to see you on Sunday. Okay.
How do you spell her name?
Vanga. As in Victor, Anga.
Okay, thank you.
As in Victor, Anga. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, bye.
Now, insofar as I'm concerned, when I was a teenager, when I was like 13, I actually bought a whole book of all of Nostradamus's prophecies, and I read the whole thing from cover to cover, and I wasn't high. And, a lot of the stuff it's very interesting, but I'm not so sure how seriously to take it. Though the notion that the three sisters will become one, well, we're sort of seeing that insofar as Belarus and Russia are concerned. I mean, Brian, can you fill us in on that particular development that's happened as of late?
Well, I mean, that's what I'm hearing, and I don't know if there's anything conclusive from that. But also, I mean, Russia is literally absorbing parts of Ukraine, as we talk. So
yeah,
the idea that most of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, in one way or another, will be unified, maybe not as a single nation, but as a very closely knit bloc, I think that's not far-fetched at all. I think we're watching that happen. To what degree? That's the only question.
But insofar as Belarus and Russia are concerned, I mean, really, it's sort of like Russia is gently but relentlessly absorbing Belarus.
They're absorbed, but
Dima is in Belarus, so
yes,
he's the man to ask.
We have a very nice relations between Belarus and Russia. They supply and support Belarus with cheap gas, with cheap oil. They buy everything that the economy of Belarus produce. So we are like small Switzerland in this particular region. So we don't need to worry about anything. Everything we produce, the Russians takes. We get free loans. We get of course, the level of life is not so high in Europe. But if we're talking about this particular region, everything is not so bad. And to tell the truth, I know a lot of Ukrainians who moved to Belarus, and they were very happy to do this because it's a very nice country, calm country, without any problems, without strikes, without meetings, without fights, without everything. I'm not talking about 2020. It's like it's not about this, but anyway, there are less problems.
I'm moving to Belarus. Yeah, I'm packing my bags for Minsk as we speak.
You can. I will be very happy to see you here.
Okay, so we've been going on for close to an hour, close to 2 hours rather. And so I like to wind these down and have it like a comfortable length. Is there anything else that you guys would really like to touch upon before we say our goodbyes?
Well, I'll just reiterate that I think Bakhmut is part of Russia's war of attrition, and the whole point of this is to just suck in Ukraine's military and just destroy it. And I think that's what we're watching. And I find it very interesting. Everybody, gathering information and talking about possible offenses. You cannot rule anything out at all. But I honestly think the safest, most conservative bet for Russia is to just continue doing this on as large of a scale as they can afford to do without overextending themselves again, because that is what they did. Now it is Ukraine that is overextended. I kept saying over and over again that those offensives at Kherson and Kharkov was not the beginning of some great Ukrainian victory. It's the beginning of the end for Ukraine's military.
With that retrospectively, do you think that was the peak moment when they should have negotiated some sort of ceasefire?
Yeah. Throughout this entire process, the sooner they did that, the better. But they never will, because they're not in charge. Washington is, and Washington is not paying in terms of money or blood, and they want to keep this going for as long as possible. And that really is the true tragedy of all of this.
Yeah. Dima, Alex, you guys want to join in with some final thoughts?
I would like to say that I hope that the war in Ukraine will be finished by the end of this roundtable.
Yes, the sooner the better.
Next 5 minutes, yeah. Alex?
Well, I just wonder about the future of it all. Like, what could happen? We talk about countries intervening, if NATO is going to intervene, all this. It's interesting to see that. I usually make videos about past historical events, and when you analyze past historical events, it's always so obvious because you have all the data. But now we're in the middle of it, and we actually face so much uncertainty. We barely have any variables, and it's very interesting because we put ourselves in the shoes of previous people that only have so much information, and they have to make decisions with the little they have, or trying to predict and talk about events they only have so much information about. So for me, it's very interesting. But looking at what's happening now in Ukraine, in a way, I feel that perhaps the goal would be to convince Ukrainians that it would be better to be with Russia. Like, if Russia wants to win, at one point they will have to try to convince the opponents that it's better to be with them. This is what the Russians did. Again, during previous wars, they have to find a way to convince the other to win. And Ukrainians, the same thing. The Ukrainians, if they want Donbass, they have to convince the people of Donbass that it's better to be with them, right? So at the end of yes, we talk about military forces, but at the end, there's always this political aspect of convincing the other that it's better to join them or stop the war.
Yeah. No, one of the things that you point out is that, when we read about wars in the past, we have all the data. And so we say, oh, this general, he was so stupid. Look at this stupid mistake he made. But at the time, putting yourself in his shoes at that moment with the information available, often you realize that they made what seemed at the time to be very reasonable, rational, very competent decisions that proved catastrophic. And so that's the thing. But what seems to strike me is that the people who are in charge now, they have a plethora of information, and yet they are consistently making the wrong choice insofar as the conduct of this conflict is concerned. They keep underestimating the Russians. I mean, the West, with the sanctions, they thought that they would crush the Russians in 30 days, and look what happened.
Well,
their economy is better than ever.
Gonzalo, sometimes I think that top leaders, don't actually have that much information. Think of Ursula von der Leyen. She's actually briefed by a set of advisors. Let's say she has 10 advisors that brief her about the situation. What if these 10 people are not that good, right? and they also get their information from somewhere. So imagine you're there, you're the leader, but you're briefed by so many people. What if they're ignorant or idiotic at best, right?
Yeah.
So but so you make poor decisions according to the people that brief you.
Yeah.
And so at the end, how much information do they actually know? I don't know.
That's a
And Alex is absolutely right, because you remember van der Leyen saying, 100,000 Ukrainian officers. She clearly has no clue how anything.
And she was the Secretary of Defense or the Minister of Defense of Germany. Jesus.
And she knows nothing. And so I think Alex's point is really important to keep in mind, especially when talking about the West. There's so many unqualified people, and they have unqualified advisors. I'm almost certain of it.
Oh yeah. And even presidents. 1 second, presidents, they have a huge set of advisors, panels, ministers. Their own ministers have advisors. So when they all meet up, who's actually making decisions?
Yeah. And also with Larry Johnson,
money always make decisions.
Yeah,
exactly.
Larry Johnson over at sonar21.com, which is a great blog that he runs. Larry Johnson says that what's happened is that insofar as the West is concerned, the United States is concerned, and he was a former CIA analyst. He says that the leadership, the analysts, the people at the CIA and the intelligence community are only presenting the information that will support a previously established view. Nothing that contradicts it. And so, of course, the decisions they are making are based on extremely biased information that plays into their desires as opposed to the reality on the ground. As compared to the Russians, who the Russian leadership at least seems to be realistic. No matter how ugly the reality, they face it. Whereas the Western leadership goes out of its way to paint everything as rosy pictures and that everything is going to go their way. I think that's the great flaw of the West, that they don't want to look at the ugly realities. They only want to see the pretty pictures. Yeah. Okay. So we've been going on for 2 hours. I promised you that we'd end at this point. Chat, thank you very much for being on. And by the way, I want to thank my moderators, Zariel, Reckless Abandon, Susie Q, and I'm missing somebody. There was a fourth moderator who was on for a time. I'm sorry, I forgot who it was. My apologies. I'll give you a shout out next time. To my guests, Brian Berletic, you can find him at the New Atlas channel. His link is in the description below, and from there you can find the other links where he puts out his work. Dima at the Military Summary channel, his link is in the description below as well. And finally, Alex of History Legends. He's linked below. Guys, stick around a little bit after the end of the show so I can... Oh, JJ. Yeah, JJ was the moderator. Thank you so much, JJ. And so, yeah, the links are all in the description below. And from there, you can find their other links to other stuff that they're doing. I suggest you check them all out because they're really, really... well, you've seen the broadcast. I mean, the guys have got brains, But like I said, I got the beauty. Yeah, this double chin, sexy. Anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me. Stick around after the show and to chat. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you next time.